Hey guys, tonight we wander into the warm twilight of the ancient Persian world, where a powerful empire sits beneath wide skies, dusty hills, and a sun that seems personally committed to making everyone a little uncomfortable by midday. You're standing somewhere on the Iranian plateau about 2.500 years ago. The air dry enough that your lips immediately begin negotiating for moisture. And yet, somehow, people here are about to create the most peaceful green spaces the ancient world has ever seen. Not just gardens. Paradise. Now, before we get too comfortable imagining shady trees and trickling fountains, there's one small reality check. You probably wouldn't survive long as an ancient Persian gardener. Not because the job is especially dangerous, although wrestling irrigation channels in the heat isn't exactly spa day material, but because the work requires patience, discipline, and a tolerance for sun that would make modern beachgoers reconsider their life choices. Still, tonight you get the easy version. You get to stroll slowly through history while other people do the digging. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, feel free to post your location and local time in the comments. It's always oddly comforting to know where in the world everyone is drifting off tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin on the edge of an empire that stretches farther than most people alive can imagine. The Achaemenid Persian Empire, at its height, spreads from the Indus Valley all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. It includes parts of modern Iran, Iraq, Egypt, Turkey, Afghanistan, and beyond. Millions of people live under Persian rule, speaking different languages, worshipping different gods, eating wildly different dinners. And yet across this enormous territory, one quiet idea begins to spread: the idea of the perfect garden. Now, at first this might sound like a surprisingly peaceful hobby for an empire famous for massive armies and monumental architecture. But in ancient Persia, gardens are not just pretty places to nap after lunch. They represent order, civilization, and control over the chaos of nature. Which is particularly impressive when nature around you mostly looks like rocks. You scan the landscape and see rolling hills of pale dust, scattered shrubs, and long stretches where the earth appears to have taken an extended vacation from greenery. Rainfall here is limited and unpredictable. Summers are brutally hot, water is precious. And that is precisely why the garden becomes so powerful. To create a lush green space in this environment is not just landscaping, it's a demonstration of mastery. Historians widely agree that the Persian garden tradition begins during the Achaemenid period around the 6th century BCE. Especially under rulers like Cyrus the Great, royal palaces start incorporating carefully designed gardens with trees, flowers, and flowing water. But the idea itself may be older. Some scholars believe early Iranian tribes already valued enclosed green spaces long before the empire formed. Others argue the concept developed alongside urban palace complexes. Historians still argue whether the earliest paradise gardens were purely royal projects or whether smaller versions existed in private estates first. Either way, the Persian kings quickly recognized the political potential of a good garden. Imagine visiting a royal palace after traveling for days through dusty plains. The sun beats down on your shoulders. Your sandals have become unofficial storage containers for sand. And then suddenly the palace gates open. Inside, there is shade. Actual shade. Tall cypress trees line straight pathways. Water channels reflect sunlight in gentle ripples. Birds chatter in the branches as if they've been hired specifically for background music. You would probably assume the king is favored by the gods. Which, conveniently, is exactly the impression the king hopes to create. Persian rulers understand symbolism extremely well. A carefully ordered garden suggests a ruler who can bring harmony to the world itself. The garden becomes a miniature version of the empire, organized, controlled, flourishing. And for visitors arriving from dry landscapes, the effect is almost magical. Even the layout of these gardens carries meaning. Many early Persian gardens are enclosed by walls, separating the cultivated paradise inside from the harsher wilderness outside. In a way, It's the ancient equivalent of stepping from a chaotic parking lot into a perfectly air-conditioned botanical garden. Except instead of a gift shop at the end, you might meet the emperor. The Persians even develop a specific word for these enclosed garden spaces, paradisa. It's a term that originally means something like walled enclosure. But over centuries, as the idea spreads across languages and cultures, the word slowly transforms. Eventually, it becomes the word we know today as paradise. So yes, the peaceful image you might associate with heavenly gardens actually has its roots in the dusty engineering projects of ancient Persia. Not bad branding, honestly. But none of this paradise talk would matter without solving one enormous problem. Water. Without water, even the most ambitious king is just staring at a patch of very expensive dirt. And that means behind every peaceful Persian garden stands an army of engineers, laborers, and gardeners quietly performing one of the most impressive technological tricks of the ancient world. They are about to move water across deserts, through mountains, and beneath the earth itself. All so that somewhere inside palace walls, a cypress tree can cast the perfect patch of afternoon shade. And as you slowly walk deeper into the empire, past dusty roads and stone cities, the dream of paradise gardens is just beginning to take shape. The trees are still young. The canals are still being carved. And the gardeners, somewhere nearby, are already planning how to turn this dry land into something surprisingly close to heaven. You pass through a tall wooden gate set in a thick mud brick wall. And almost immediately the world changes. Outside the enclosure, the land is pale and dry, the wind pushing small clouds of dust across the ground like lazy ghosts. Inside, the air feels softer somehow. The ground under your feet is packed earth, but shaded by rows of trees that filter the sunlight into calm, shifting patterns. This place has a name the Persians use with quiet pride: paradisa. The word rolls slowly off the tongue, paradisa, and at its most basic level it simply means an enclosed space. A walled garden. But language has a funny way of letting simple words grow bigger over time. The way a small sapling eventually becomes the tallest tree in the garden. In this case, paradisa will travel through centuries and across empires. The Greeks will hear the word and adapt it into paradisos. Later, through Latin and various religious traditions, it becomes the English word you know today: paradise. Historians widely agree this linguistic journey is real, though they still debate exactly how the meaning evolved along the way. Some scholars argue the word originally referred strictly to royal hunting parks rather than tranquil flower gardens. Others believe it always carried the sense of a carefully maintained, sacred landscape. Either way, when you stand inside one of these early Persian enclosures, you begin to understand why the word eventually took on heavenly associations. Because the contrast is dramatic. Outside the walls, heat, wind, and endless beige terrain. Inside, shade, water, and the quiet murmur of life. You stroll along a straight pathway bordered by young cypress trees. Cypress is a favorite in Persian gardens, partly because it stays green all year and partly because it's tall. Elegant shape suggests dignity and eternity. It's basically the ancient Persian equivalent of planting something classy but low maintenance. And if you've ever tried to keep a houseplant alive, you know low maintenance is an important quality. To your left runs a narrow water channel, barely wider than your foot. The water moves slowly, guided along the path by carefully carved stone edges. Every few meters, the channel widens into a small basin where the water gathers before continuing its journey. The sound is subtle. A gentle trickle. The kind of noise that modern relaxation apps try very hard to imitate. Historians often point out that the Persian garden isn't just decorative, it's symbolic. The enclosure itself represents the human effort to create order within a chaotic world. The walls define a boundary between cultivated harmony and wild nature. In ancient Persian thought, especially influenced by early Zoroastrian beliefs, the world is often seen as a balance between order and disorder. A garden becomes a small model of cosmic balance, life thriving in an environment carefully protected from destructive forces. In other words, gardening here is practically philosophical. Though, to be fair, The gardeners themselves might describe it more as very hot outdoor work with occasional philosophical side effects. You walk deeper into the garden and begin noticing how carefully everything is arranged. The paths intersect at clean angles. Trees stand in organized rows. Water channels run with mathematical precision. This is not the chaotic tangle of plants you might find in a wild forest. This is geometry with leaves. One of the mainstream historical facts scholars highlight is that Persian gardens were among the earliest examples of formal landscape design. Archaeological evidence from sites like Pasargadae suggests that planners deliberately created symmetrical layouts, aligning water channels and planting beds with architectural structures. The result is a sense of calm order. Even if you didn't know the deeper symbolism, your brain would probably relax just looking at it. There are also some wonderfully quirky details about these early gardens. For example, many royal Persian parks included not only fruit trees and flowers but also small animals. Birds are especially welcome guests. Some historians believe the gardens were intentionally planted to attract songbirds, turning the space into a living orchestra of chirps and whistles. Imagine an ancient king strolling along a shaded path while dozens of birds provide free background music. Royal Spotify, basically. And while the garden feels peaceful, it's also a stage for power. Visiting diplomats, generals, and nobles are often invited to walk through these spaces with the king. Conversations happen slowly along the paths, under trees that quietly remind everyone how much effort and wealth went into creating this environment. You might arrive expecting a political meeting in a throne room. Instead, you get a long walk among pomegranates and roses, which is honestly a much better meeting format. Historians still argue whether these gardens were primarily private royal retreats or semi-public spaces used for ceremonies and receptions. Some texts suggest elite guests could wander certain sections freely, while other areas remained strictly restricted. Either way, the garden sends a message. It tells every visitor, this empire can command water in the desert. And that's not an easy trick. Because the small channel trickling beside you right now represents something remarkable. That water didn't appear here by accident. It has traveled through a carefully engineered system that may stretch kilometers across the landscape. Some of it might even be flowing beneath the ground. You pause beside a shallow pool where the water reflects the blue sky like a tiny mirror. A dragonfly hovers briefly above the surface before darting away. Somewhere far away, unseen workers are maintaining tunnels, clearing sediment, guiding underground streams toward this exact spot. The garden feels effortless. But it's actually the final, peaceful result of a massive engineering achievement. And if you follow the water back to its source, leaving the comfort of the trees behind, you'll discover the quiet technological miracle that makes Persian paradise possible. Because long before modern pipes and pumps, Persian engineers have already invented one of the most ingenious irrigation systems in human history. And it runs silently beneath your feet. You step away from the shaded garden paths and follow the thin ribbon of water as it slips quietly out through a narrow stone channel in the garden wall. The moment you leave the enclosure, the soft calm of the paradise garden fades behind you like the closing of a door. The sun feels stronger again. The wind carries dust. And suddenly it becomes very clear that this water has traveled a long way to reach that peaceful little pool you were admiring a moment ago. The Persians call the system that delivers it a qanat. If you imagine ancient engineers dramatically building towering aqueducts like the Romans later will, you'd be slightly off the mark. Persian engineers prefer a quieter solution, one that works almost entirely underground. Which, honestly, is probably the best possible place for water in a desert. A qanat is essentially a gently sloping tunnel that carries water from mountain aquifers down into dry lowlands. Instead of relying on pumps or lifting devices, the system uses gravity alone. Water flows slowly through underground channels, protected from evaporation by layers of earth above. The idea is deceptively simple. Dig a tunnel that slopes just enough for water to move. Don't let it collapse. Also make it stretch for kilometers. Easy, right? In reality, building a qanat requires extraordinary skill. Workers must locate underground water sources high in the hills, then dig a horizontal tunnel that gradually descends toward the plains. Along the route, they dig vertical shafts every few dozen meters. You begin to notice them now, small circular openings in the ground scattered across the landscape like a line of ancient wells. These shafts serve several purposes. They allow workers to remove soil while digging the tunnel, provide ventilation, and give access for future maintenance. From the surface, the line of holes almost looks like someone carefully poked the desert with a giant knitting needle. And yes, historians believe some connaughts extend for more than 30 kilometers. Which means ancient workers spent years carving tunnels through soil and rock with little more than hand tools and determination. The earliest connaughts likely appear in Persia sometime around the early 1st millennium BCE. Though the exact origin remains debated, historians still argue whether the technology first developed in the Iranian plateau itself or if earlier irrigation concepts inspired it. What most scholars agree on, however, is that the Persian Empire perfected the technique and then spread it. From Persia, the Connaught system eventually appears across the Middle East, North Africa, Central Asia, and even parts of Spain. Some versions survive for thousands of years and still function today, which is frankly impressive considering many modern plumbing systems struggle to survive a single enthusiastic home renovation. You follow the line of ventilation shafts up a gentle hillside. Workers are busy at one of the openings, lowering a basket attached to a rope. When it comes back up, the basket is full of damp soil. The men empty it nearby and send it back down. It's slow work. Very slow. You can imagine the scene repeating hour after hour in the dry heat. Someone down in the tunnel carefully scraping away at the earth, someone above hauling up the debris. A quiet rhythm of digging and lifting that might continue for months. And all of this effort exists for one purpose: to keep water flowing. Water in ancient Persia isn't just useful, it's practically sacred. Zoroastrian traditions treat clean water with deep respect, seeing it as a life-giving element that must be protected from pollution. That reverence probably helps explain why the engineering around it is so careful. If the slope of a connaught is too steep, water flows too fast and damages the tunnel. Too shallow, and the water stagnates. Engineers must calculate the gradient with remarkable precision, without modern surveying equipment. Historians still argue exactly how they achieved this accuracy. Some believe they used simple measuring tools and water levels. Others suggest experienced builders simply developed an intuitive understanding of terrain over generations. Either way, the result is astonishing. You crouch beside one of the shafts and feel cool air drifting upward from the tunnel below. Somewhere beneath your feet, water is moving slowly through darkness toward the garden you just left. Invisible, silent, reliable. It's the ancient equivalent of a hidden plumbing system quietly doing its job while everyone else enjoys the shade. And once that water reaches the surface, Persian gardeners know exactly what to do with it. They guide it through channels, pools, and planting beds designed with mathematical elegance. Every drop is directed carefully, because wasting water here would be like casually throwing gold coins into the wind. Speaking of gold, there's a slightly odd historical tidbit about connaughts. In some periods of Persian history, people who successfully built new connaughts were rewarded with ownership rights to the water they produced for several generations. This created entire families of professional connaught builders whose expertise became incredibly valuable. You could say they were the ancient world's version of highly paid infrastructure consultants. Except instead of PowerPoint presentations, they brought shovels. As the afternoon light begins to soften, you watch water finally emerge from the connaught outlet further down the slope. It spills into a small open canal and starts its quiet journey across the land toward fields, orchards, and, eventually, those tranquil gardens. The moment feels oddly satisfying. All that hidden work underground. All that careful engineering. Just to make a small stream appear in the open air. And somewhere beyond the dusty horizon, inside cool palace walls, a cypress tree waits patiently to drink from it. The gardeners are ready. The channels are prepared. And the dream of building paradise in the desert is about to grow roots. By the time the water reaches the royal grounds, the gardeners are already waiting. You follow the canal as it curves gently across the plain toward a palace complex rising in pale stone ahead. The walls shimmer slightly in the afternoon heat, but just beyond them you can see the first hints of green, rows of trees and shrubs peeking over the top like curious spectators. Inside the walls, the atmosphere changes again. The dry wind fades. The air smells faintly of damp soil and leaves. It's subtle, but after walking through the dusty countryside it feels almost luxurious. This is where the dream of the Persian paradise garden begins to take real shape. Workers kneel beside narrow channels carved into the earth, guiding water with small clay barriers and wooden tools. The irrigation system spreads outward like a branching river, dividing into smaller streams that feed planting beds and young trees. One of the mainstream historical facts archaeologists often point out is that Persian gardens were carefully planned long before the first tree was planted. At sites like Basargadae in Susa, excavations reveal stone-lined channels arranged in symmetrical patterns, suggesting that architects and engineers worked closely together. This is landscaping with blueprints, which is probably reassuring if you're about to plant hundreds of trees in a place where rainfall can be, let's say, unreliable. You wander along a gravel path where several gardeners are tending newly planted saplings. Their tools are simple, wooden spades, baskets, clay pitchers, but their work is meticulous. They measure distances between trees with practiced eyes, ensuring that each one has enough room to grow while still maintaining the precise geometry of the garden. Because symmetry matters here, Persian designers prefer order, straight lines, balanced spacing, water flowing evenly through mirrored channels. It's a little like turning nature into a quiet architectural partner. Historians widely believe these early royal gardens were designed to complement palace buildings themselves. When you stand on the palace terrace and look out, the garden isn't random greenery, it's a carefully arranged landscape that mirrors the structure of the royal court. Power, translated into trees and water. You stop beside a young pomegranate tree whose thin branches are just beginning to leaf out. The gardener beside it presses soil gently around the base of the trunk. Pomegranates are one of the most beloved plants in Persian gardens. They thrive in warm climates and produce brilliant red fruit packed with seeds. In many ancient cultures, including Persia, the fruit symbolizes fertility, life, and abundance. Plus, it's delicious. So if you're an ancient king trying to impress visitors, having an orchard full of bright red fruit probably doesn't hurt your reputation. Nearby, another gardener tends to a row of rose bushes. Persia becomes famous for roses over the centuries, and many historians believe Persian gardeners helped spread rose cultivation across large parts of the ancient world. There's something wonderfully soothing about watching the process unfold. A channel of water opens. A patch of earth darkens. A sapling is planted. Then another. And another. Slowly, patiently, a dry patch of land transforms into something living. Of course, gardens of this scale don't appear overnight. Some royal projects likely take decades to mature. Trees need years to grow tall enough to provide meaningful shade, which means the gardeners planting them might never fully enjoy the results of their work. It's a strangely humble contribution to royal glory. Historians still argue whether Persian kings themselves actively participated in planting trees or if this was mostly symbolic storytelling added later. Some ancient texts describe rulers personally planting trees in palace gardens, presenting the act as a sign of wisdom and connection to the land. Other scholars suspect the kings mostly supervised while someone else did the actual digging. Which, if you've ever attempted serious gardening in the summer heat, sounds like a very reasonable leadership strategy. You continue walking along the developing garden paths and notice small stone basins placed at intervals along the water channels. These pools serve both practical and aesthetic purposes. They slow the flow of water, allow sediment to settle, and create reflective surfaces that catch sunlight. The effect is subtle but beautiful. The garden doesn't roar with fountains the way later Roman gardens sometimes will. Instead, Persian water features are quieter, gentle trickles, small ripples, calm reflections, a kind of natural white noise for ancient aristocrats. And speaking of aristocrats, the garden is not just a peaceful retreat, it's also a stage for royal life. Visiting officials, diplomats, and scholars will eventually stroll these paths while discussing politics, trade, and philosophy. Imagine negotiating the fate of an entire province while casually walking past a row of flowering trees. It's diplomacy with better scenery. You pause near a newly dug channel where two workers are adjusting the flow of water with a flat wooden board. The stream divides neatly into two directions, sending equal portions toward separate sections of the garden. The precision is impressive. Every part of this system must work in balance. Too much water and roots rot. Too little and the plants struggle. Maintaining that balance becomes the daily responsibility of the garden staff. And there are quite a few of them. Royal gardens require teams of laborers, irrigation specialists, tree pruners, and seasonal workers, while the king receives the admiration of visitors. The real caretakers of paradise spend their days knee-deep in soil and canal water, quietly making sure the illusion of effortless beauty continues. The sun begins to dip lower, casting longer shadows across the growing orchard. Leaves shimmer softly in the warm evening light. And as you walk deeper into the grounds, toward the oldest and most carefully designed sections of the royal estate, you're about to encounter the garden that many historians believe started it all. A place built by one of the most famous rulers in ancient history. A king who decided that even in the middle of a vast empire, it was worth creating a little piece of paradise. You continue along the gently curving path until the young gardens of the outer palace give way to something older, more established. The trees here are taller, their trunks thicker, their shade deeper. The irrigation channels are lined with carefully fitted stone blocks instead of packed earth. This part of the garden feels deliberate, almost ceremonial. You've arrived at Pasargadae, the royal capital founded by Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BCE. And somewhere within this quiet landscape lies one of the most important gardens in the history of human design. Historians widely believe the gardens of Pasargadae represent the earliest known example of the formal Persian paradise garden, which means the peaceful layout around you may have influenced landscape architecture for more than 2,000 years. No pressure. Cyrus the Great, founder of the Achaemenid Empire, is remembered as a remarkably pragmatic ruler. He conquers vast territories but also gains a reputation for tolerance toward different cultures and religions within his empire. He also apparently enjoys a very good garden. Ancient Greek writers like Xenophon later described Cyrus taking personal interest in the gardens around his palaces. In one story, he proudly shows a visitor the orderly rows of trees he has planted himself. Historians still argue whether Cyrus truly did much of the planting personally or whether this anecdote is more symbolic than literal. After all, running the largest empire of its time probably kept him fairly busy. Still, the story captures an important idea. The Persian king is a steward of cultivated land. As you walk through Pasargadae's garden remains, you notice something fascinating about the layout. The channels intersect. Stone-lined watercourses run straight across the garden, crossing at right angles and dividing the space into large rectangular plots. Even after centuries of erosion, archaeologists can still trace these lines. One of the mainstream historical facts uncovered through excavation is that these channels were not random irrigation ditches. They were carefully designed features integrated into the garden's visual plan. The water itself becomes part of the architecture. Imagine standing on the palace terrace overlooking this landscape. Long straight channels reflect the sky like mirrors, dividing orchards and flower beds into balanced sections. Trees line the edges, casting narrow shadows that stretch across the water. It's elegant, orderly, almost mathematical. Which makes sense, because the Persians loved the idea that a garden could reflect cosmic harmony. 4 channels intersecting at a central point may symbolize the 4 rivers described in ancient Near Eastern traditions about the structure of the world. Historians still debate whether this symbolism was intentional at Pasargadae or if later interpretations added the cosmic meaning. But the visual balance is undeniable. You walk beside one of the channels, its stone edges worn smooth by time. Imagine clear water once flowing steadily through this narrow corridor, glinting in the sunlight while fruit trees rustled above. Speaking of fruit trees, Persian royal gardens were not just decorative landscapes. They were productive orchards. You would likely find pomegranates, figs, almonds, grapes, and possibly apples growing in different sections of the garden. These fruits not only provided food for the royal household but also reinforced the symbolic message of abundance. Because what better way to demonstrate imperial prosperity than walking through a landscape literally dripping with fruit? It's a subtle flex. The ancient equivalent of saying, "Yes, our empire is doing quite well. Thank you," while casually handing someone a perfectly ripe fig. One quirky detail archaeologists discovered at Pasargadae is evidence of slightly raised planting beds between the water channels. These may have helped control irrigation and prevent flooding during heavier water flow. But they also created neat rectangular plots, almost like giant garden boxes. If you squint a little, the layout resembles an enormous, very organized vegetable garden, just, designed for an emperor. Birdsong drifts through the air as you continue along the pathways. Persian gardens were famous for attracting birds, thanks to the water sources and fruit trees. Some scholars even believe certain plantings were selected specifically to encourage bird life, turning the gardens into peaceful sanctuaries of sound. Imagine diplomats visiting Cyrus's palace and finding themselves surrounded by chirping sparrows and cooing doves while discussing trade agreements. It's hard to argue aggressively about taxes when a pomegranate tree is dropping fruit nearby. You reach a slightly raised terrace where the view opens across the garden's symmetrical layout. From here, the geometry becomes clearer. Straight lines, balanced plots, water channels forming quiet intersections. Even after thousands of years, the structure of Cyrus's paradise is still visible. Historians continue debating how much influence this specific garden had on later Persian designs. Some argue Pasargadae established the blueprint for the famous Shahar Bagh layout that appears centuries later. Others think the evolution was more gradual. Either way, the concept of a structured paradise garden spreads quickly through Persian culture. Other royal cities begin building similar landscapes. Noble estates copy the idea on smaller scales. The enclosed garden becomes a symbol of refined living across the empire. And it all begins with this simple but powerful combination: water, trees, geometry. You stand quietly beside the ancient channel and imagine the scene in its prime. Cypress trees towering overhead, roses blooming along shaded paths, clear water sliding across stone. And somewhere nearby, perhaps even right where you're standing, Cyrus the Great himself once walked through the garden he believed could mirror the order of the universe. Not a bad afternoon stroll. But the design principles shaping this place are about to become even more refined. Because Persian garden planners are just getting started with their most famous idea. A layout so elegant it will influence gardens from Spain to India. And it all begins with the quiet symmetry of 4 flowing rivers. You continue along the stone channel until it reaches a perfect intersection. 2 narrow waterways meet at right angles, dividing the garden into 4 equal sections. The water flows gently through each branch, glimmering in the late afternoon sun like thin ribbons of glass laid carefully across the earth. If the earlier parts of the garden felt organized, this part feels almost philosophical. Welcome to the idea that will eventually define Persian garden design, the Shahar Bagh. The phrase simply means 4 gardens in Persian, but the concept carries a much deeper meaning. Instead of planting trees randomly or arranging beds however space allows, Persian designers divide the entire garden into 4 symmetrical quadrants. 4 sections. 4 pathways. 4 flowing channels of water. The result is a design that feels calm, balanced, and almost meditative to walk through. And once you notice it, you can't really unsee it. You walk down one of the central paths, the water channel running neatly beside you. On either side, trees grow in tidy rows, pomegranates, figs, and tall cypress forming a mixture of fruit-bearing branches and evergreen shade. This is not just practical agriculture. It's symbolic architecture made out of living plants. One widely accepted historical interpretation is that the 4-part design reflects ancient cosmological ideas about paradise. in several Near Eastern traditions, including later Islamic descriptions of heaven. Paradise is imagined as a garden with 4 rivers flowing outward in different directions. Water representing life, nourishment, and eternal renewal. Historians still argue whether early Achaemenid gardens intentionally reflected this symbolism or if the meaning became clearer during later Persian and Islamic periods. Archaeological evidence shows the layout existed early on, but written explanations of its spiritual meaning appear centuries later. In other words, the design might have started as clever irrigation geometry and slowly acquired cosmic significance. Which honestly happens more often than you'd think in history. Someone invents a practical solution, and a few generations later philosophers show up and say, actually, this represents the structure of the universe. The gardeners probably just shrug and keep trimming the hedges. Still, the visual effect is undeniable. Standing at the center of the garden, you can see straight paths extending in 4 directions. Like spokes on a wheel, the water channels reflect patches of sky, while the surrounding trees create gentle walls of green. It's easy to imagine why later cultures associate this design with paradise. You wander into one of the 4 garden quadrants where flowering plants fill the air with faint fragrance. Persian gardens are famous for roses, and although the varieties here might look different from modern hybrids, their scent is just as rich. A few bees drift lazily between blossoms. Somewhere nearby, a gardener is pruning a branch with a curved knife, carefully shaping the tree so sunlight filters evenly through the canopy. Because maintaining this symmetry is a constant job. Left alone, plants would grow unevenly, roots would block channels, and the tidy 4-part harmony would slowly drift toward botanical chaos. Garden staff must constantly trim, redirect water, and replace aging trees. Paradise, it turns out, requires a surprising amount of maintenance. One charming historical detail is that Persian garden designers often aligned the main pathways with the cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west. This alignment reinforced the sense that the garden reflected the order of the natural world. So when you stand at the central crossing, you are literally positioned at a symbolic center of the universe. Not bad for an afternoon walk. You glance down at the water channel and notice something interesting. Small stone ridges interrupt the flow every few meters, creating tiny ripples. These little barriers serve a practical purpose. They slow the water and help distribute it evenly through branching channels. But they also create gentle sound. A soft bubbling. The kind of quiet background noise that makes the garden feel alive. Modern relaxation apps would absolutely charge a monthly subscription for this soundscape. Another quirky tidbit historians have uncovered is that some Persian gardens included small raised platforms or pavilions near the central intersection. These provided shaded seating areas where the king or guests could sit and observe the garden's symmetry. Imagine lounging in the exact middle of a perfectly balanced landscape while servants bring chilled drinks and bowls of fruit. It's a design that encourages slow living. Of course, the Shahar Bagh layout also makes practical sense for irrigation. Dividing the garden into 4 equal sections allows water to be distributed efficiently from a central source. Gardeners can open or block small channels depending on which area needs more moisture. Efficient, elegant, and visually calming. As the sun continues to sink toward the horizon, long shadows stretch across the paths, and the water channels begin reflecting deeper shades of gold and orange. Birds settle into the trees overhead. Somewhere in the distance, you hear the quiet scrape of tools as gardeners finish their daily work. Because behind the serene geometry of the Shahar Bagh lies a small army of people making sure everything continues flowing exactly as planned. And if you follow one of the shaded paths deeper into the garden complex, you'll soon meet the people whose entire lives revolve around keeping this paradise alive. The quiet caretakers of the empire's most peaceful spaces. The gardeners themselves. You follow one of the shaded paths away from the perfectly balanced center of the garden. And gradually the atmosphere changes again. The symmetrical display of royal landscaping fades into quieter working areas, places visitors rarely linger but which quietly keep the entire paradise alive. The paths here are narrower, the soil darker from constant watering, and you can hear the steady splash of water being lifted from a basin. This is the gardener's world. And it turns out paradise has a fairly busy maintenance schedule. A group of workers kneels beside a canal, using small wooden paddles to clear away silt that has settled along the bottom. One man scoops the muddy sediment into a basket while another adjusts a clay gate that controls the water flow toward a row of young trees. Nothing about the process looks glamorous. In fact, if royal gardens had job advertisements, they might read something like, "Wanted, patient individuals comfortable with mud, heat, and occasionally stubborn fig trees." Still, these gardeners hold an incredibly important role within Persian estates. One mainstream historical fact historians point out is that large royal gardens required organized labor teams. Records from later Persian periods, and even earlier administrative systems in the empire, suggest that palace grounds often employed permanent staff responsible for irrigation, pruning, planting, and harvesting. These weren't casual hobbyists. They were skilled workers whose knowledge of water management and plant care made the entire garden system possible. You watch one older gardener inspecting the bark of a cypress tree. His hands move slowly along the trunk, checking for signs of insects or disease. Cypress trees are prized not only for their beauty but also because they tolerate dry climates and maintain their tall, narrow shape without constant shaping. Still, even hardy trees appreciate a little attention now and then. Nearby, two younger workers carry woven baskets filled with dried leaves and trimmed branches. Garden waste isn't simply thrown away. Much of it will eventually become compost, enriching the soil for the next season's planting. The cycle is surprisingly modern. Grow plants. Trim plants. Turn the leftovers into fertilizer. Repeat forever. Historians sometimes remark that ancient Persian gardeners had an advanced understanding of soil health long before modern agricultural science put official terminology to it. You stroll past a small tool shed built of mud brick and shaded by grapevines climbing along a wooden frame. Inside, tools hang neatly along the wall, curved knives, wooden hose, and simple pruning shears forged from iron. There's even a bundle of thin reed measuring rods used to keep planting rows straight. Which is a reminder that geometry in Persian gardens isn't just aesthetic, it's actively maintained. One gardener kneels beside a channel intersection, adjusting a small barrier made from packed clay. The water level shifts slightly, redirecting the flow toward a dry section of soil. It's like watching someone adjust the controls of a very slow-moving irrigation machine. Historians still argue exactly how specialized these gardening roles were. Some believe palace estates employed workers who focused exclusively on irrigation engineering, while others suggest many gardeners performed multiple tasks depending on the season. What's clear is that the system required constant human oversight. Without gardeners opening and closing channels, clearing roots from canals, and replanting aging trees, the paradise would slowly unravel. Water would stagnate, plants would wither, symmetry would collapse into botanical anarchy. Which, if you've ever neglected a backyard garden for a few weeks, you know can happen surprisingly quickly. You wander toward a shaded resting area where several gardeners sit on low stools, sharing a clay pitcher of water. Their conversation drifts quietly through the air. Though you don't catch every word, you notice they talk about things that sound very familiar to modern gardeners: weather patterns, soil conditions, and which tree is producing the best fruit this year. One man gestures toward a row of pomegranate trees with obvious pride. Apparently that section of the orchard is having an excellent season. A quirky historical tidbit about Persian gardens is that fruit harvests from royal estates sometimes served diplomatic purposes. Visiting officials might receive baskets of figs, grapes, or pomegranates as gifts. Imagine negotiating trade agreements while someone hands you a bowl of fresh fruit picked from the king's own garden. It's hard to leave a bad review after that. The gardeners soon return to work, and you continue along the path toward another section of the estate where younger trees grow in long, orderly lines. These nurseries are the future of the garden. Saplings are raised here until they're strong enough to be transplanted into the main landscape. Some will eventually replace aging trees in the orchard. while others may be planted in entirely new gardens across the empire. Because Persian garden design isn't staying confined to one palace. The idea is spreading. But before these gardens can expand, the empire must gather an astonishing variety of plants, trees, flowers, and herbs from across its vast territories. You glance across the nursery beds where rows of unfamiliar saplings stretch toward the fading sunlight. Some of these plants come from distant mountains, others from river valleys hundreds of miles away. And the royal gardeners are quietly turning the entire Persian Empire into a giant botanical catalog. You step past the nursery beds and into a section of the garden that feels almost like a living map of the empire. Trees here don't all look the same. Some have thick twisting trunks and wide leaves that cast heavy shade. Others rise tall and narrow like green pillars. The air carries a mixture of scents, sweet blossoms, damp earth, and something faintly citrusy drifting from a nearby grove. This part of the garden is less about strict symmetry and more about botanical variety. The Persian Empire is enormous, stretching across mountains, deserts, river valleys, and coastal plains, and wherever the empire expands, it collects plants. Royal gardeners quickly realize that a powerful empire has access to something incredibly useful: biodiversity. So they start experimenting. One of the most widely accepted historical facts is that Persian gardens often included fruit and ornamental plants gathered from different regions under imperial control. Pomegranates from Iranian plateaus, figs from western territories, grapes from fertile valleys, and possibly early varieties of apricots or peaches from eastern regions all find their way into royal estates. The result is something close to an ancient botanical garden. You walk beneath a row of cypress trees first. Cypress becomes one of the most iconic plants of Persian landscapes. Its tall, slender shape makes it visually striking, and it thrives in warm climates with relatively little water. But the tree also carries symbolic meaning. In Persian culture, cypress represents endurance and eternal life because it remains green year-round. Some ancient poems even compare noble characters to the straight, dignified posture of a cypress tree, which is a polite way of saying, stand up straight and stop slouching. A little further down the path you reach the pomegranate orchard. The branches are heavy with round, reddish fruit, some of which have split open slightly to reveal clusters of ruby seeds inside. Pomegranates are deeply important across the ancient Near East. They symbolize fertility, prosperity, and renewal. Plus, if you've ever eaten one, you know they're also an excellent way to accidentally stain your clothing forever. Persian gardeners adore them. Nearby, a row of fig trees spreads broad leaves that rustle softly in the breeze. Figs grow well in Mediterranean climates and have been cultivated for thousands of years. Their sweet fruit dries easily, making them a reliable food source for both palace kitchens and traveling caravans. A worker climbs a low ladder to inspect the branches, gently tapping a fig to test its ripeness. You suspect there are worse jobs than quality checking figs all afternoon. Historians still argue exactly how many plant species Persian royal gardens contained. Archaeological remains can confirm certain fruit trees through pollen analysis and seed fragments. But written descriptions from the time are often poetic rather than botanical, which means ancient writers might describe fragrant blossoms from distant mountains, without bothering to include the exact Latin plant name. Extremely inconsiderate of them, really. Still, evidence suggests Persian gardeners experimented with importing plants from far-off regions. The empire's vast trade networks made it possible to transport seeds and saplings over long distances. You pass a grove of almond trees whose pale blossoms flutter gently in the warm air. Almonds likely arrived from regions further west and adapted well to the Persian climate. Not far away grows a cluster of roses. Persia becomes legendary for roses in later centuries, and many historians believe early cultivation began in royal gardens like these. The blossoms are smaller than modern hybrid roses, but their scent is strong enough to drift through the entire pathway. If you pause long enough, the fragrance lingers in the warm evening air like a soft cloud. A quirky detail recorded in some later Persian traditions claims that certain royal gardens were so full of flowering plants that bees occasionally became overly enthusiastic. Visitors strolling through the gardens sometimes had to move carefully to avoid wandering through particularly busy pollination zones. Which is an elegant historical way of saying someone probably got chased by bees at least once. As you continue walking, the garden shifts again into a section of tall shade trees planted along a wide path. Beneath them, cool patches of earth provide space for resting benches and small stone platforms. These shaded corridors are designed for slow walks. Royal guests might stroll here during the hottest parts of the day while discussing philosophy, politics, or whatever topics polite imperial conversation tends to involve. Meanwhile, birds dart between branches overhead. Persian gardens are known for attracting birds, especially doves, sparrows, and nightingales. The combination of water, fruit, and shelter makes the gardens an irresistible habitat. Some historians even speculate that certain plantings were arranged specifically to encourage bird life. Essentially, ancient Persia invents the deluxe bird-friendly backyard. You reach the edge of a reflecting pool where the sky glows gold in the fading daylight. The water surface mirrors the branches above so perfectly that it almost looks like the trees are growing downward into another world. For a moment, everything feels still. Yet this peaceful place is more than just a garden. It's a statement of imperial reach. Every imported plant, every foreign seed growing here, quietly tells visitors that the Persian Empire stretches across climates, landscapes, and cultures. And this garden gathers a little piece of all of them. But trees and flowers are only part of the living world inside these paradise parks. Because if you linger long enough beneath the branches, you'll begin to notice the other residents who share the shade. Birds, animals, and occasionally some surprisingly relaxed royal picnics. You follow the soft sound of rustling leaves toward a quieter corner of the garden where the paths widen slightly and the trees grow thicker overhead. The shade here feels deeper, cooler, and the ground is dotted with patches of fallen fruit. Somewhere above, a bird sings a slow, looping melody that echoes through the branches. Persian gardens were never meant to be silent places. In fact, one of the subtle design goals was to encourage life, birds, insects, and small animals, to settle comfortably inside the protected walls. With steady water, fruit-bearing trees, and shelter from predators, the gardens quickly became lively ecosystems. You glance up just in time to see a small flock of doves swoop down toward the edge of a reflecting pool. They land lightly on the stone rim and begin pecking at scattered seeds left behind by gardeners. Doves were especially admired in Persian culture for their gentle behavior and soft cooing calls. Their presence in a royal garden would have added to the sense of peace the designers hoped to create. Imagine strolling through the garden while dozens of birds murmur quietly around you. No surprise people later started associating paradise with places like this. A mainstream historical observation from Persian literature is that gardens were often described not just as landscapes but as complete sensory environments. Writers frequently mention birdsong, the scent of blossoms, and the sound of water flowing through channels. It's an early example of what modern designers might call immersive landscaping. You continue along the path until it opens into a wide grassy area bordered by fruit trees. A few servants are laying out woven mats while others carry trays of food from the palace kitchens. Apparently, you've stumbled onto picnic hour. Royal gardens often served as outdoor gathering spaces where members of the court could relax, eat, and escape the heat trapped inside stone buildings. Shade trees and flowing water made these gardens some of the most comfortable places in the entire palace complex. One nobleman reclines on a cushion while nibbling figs from a small bowl. Another gestures lazily toward a nearby pomegranate tree while continuing a conversation that sounds suspiciously like politics disguised as casual chatter. You get the sense that many important imperial discussions happened in settings exactly like this. Historians still argue how formal these garden gatherings were. Some believe they resembled structured diplomatic meetings, while others think they were much more relaxed affairs where conversation wandered between philosophy, poetry, and everyday concerns. Either way, Negotiating trade agreements probably feels less stressful when someone hands you fresh fruit every few minutes. Near the edge of the clearing, a servant pours water into a shallow stone dish placed on the ground. Within moments, a few sparrows hop down from nearby branches to drink. This is another small but clever detail of Persian garden life. Bird-friendly basins and water bowls were sometimes placed around the garden, encouraging birds to linger. In return, the birds helped control insects and spread plant seeds. So the entire place becomes a carefully balanced ecosystem. You wander toward a small shaded pavilion where a pair of court musicians sit quietly with stringed instruments. Their music drifts softly across the garden, blending with the sound of water trickling through nearby channels. The effect is surprisingly calming. If you close your eyes for a moment, it's easy to forget you're standing in the middle of an ancient imperial estate. It almost feels like a park. A slightly fancier park with servants carrying trays of fruit. But still, a quirky historical tidbit comes from later Persian sources describing certain royal gardens that contained small enclosures for animals. These were not quite zoos in the modern sense, but rather areas where deer, gazelles, or exotic birds could be kept within the garden grounds. In some cases, the animals roamed fairly freely within large park-like sections. Imagine taking an afternoon walk and casually encountering a deer nibbling leaves beside the path. Historians debate how common these animal enclosures actually were in the early Achaemenid period. Some scholars think they were more typical in later Persian or Hellenistic royal parks. But the general idea of gardens doubling as gentle wildlife habitats seems fairly consistent. As the sun lowers toward the horizon, the garden becomes even more peaceful. Shadows stretch across the lawns, and the birds settle into quieter patterns of movement. You pass a pair of gardeners collecting fallen fruit in woven baskets. Nothing goes to waste. The fruit will either be eaten fresh, dried for storage, or used in palace kitchens. Persian cuisine already includes a remarkable variety of fruit-based dishes, and the royal gardens help supply that abundance. One gardener chuckles quietly as he shakes a branch and 3 figs drop neatly into his basket. You suspect this might be the most relaxed harvesting job in the ancient world. Nearby, a small canal widens into another reflective pool. Dragonflies skim across the water's surface while ripples carry tiny reflections of the sky. The entire garden now glows in soft amber light. But while these peaceful scenes feel timeless, the Persian garden concept is about to travel far beyond these palace walls. Because visitors who experience this paradise rarely forget it. And when they return to their own lands, from Greece to Central Asia, they carry the idea with them. The design, the symmetry, the quiet luxury of trees and water arranged in perfect balance. Soon, the Persian paradise garden will begin spreading across the ancient world. You wander away from the picnic lawn and back toward one of the long central pathways where tall cypress trees line the route like silent attendants. The evening air feels cooler now. Water moves slowly through the channels beside the path, reflecting streaks of gold and pink from the sky above. This is where the garden quietly transforms into something else. Not just a pleasant place to relax, but a stage for power. Because if you're an ancient Persian king, inviting someone into your garden is rarely just about enjoying the scenery. It's about demonstrating control, sophistication, and a certain effortless command over nature itself. You imagine a visiting diplomat arriving after days of travel across dusty plains. His caravan passes through palace gates, and suddenly he finds himself walking beneath shady trees beside flowing water. The contrast alone would be memorable. But the real diplomacy begins during the stroll. One widely accepted historical fact is that Persian rulers often conducted courtly conversations and informal audiences in garden settings. Ancient writers like Xenophon describe Persian kings taking guests on slow walks through cultivated parks, discussing matters of governance and philosophy. This practice might sound surprisingly modern. After all, many leaders today prefer walking meetings instead of sitting stiffly across conference tables. Apparently, the Persians were ahead of the productivity trend by about 2.500 years. You imagine Cyrus the Great, or perhaps one of his successors, walking slowly along this very path with a visiting noble. Servants follow at a respectful distance carrying trays of fruit, wine, and cool water. Every few steps the king pauses beside a flowering tree or reflective pool. The guest compliments the garden. The king nods modestly. And somewhere between discussing irrigation systems and admiring a particularly well-behaved pomegranate tree, they might also settle a political matter affecting thousands of people. Historians still argue whether these garden meetings were carefully choreographed displays or simply comfortable places where rulers preferred to talk. Some believe the gardens functioned almost like diplomatic theaters designed to impress visitors. Others suggest the kings genuinely enjoyed spending time outdoors and naturally held conversations there. Either way, it's excellent public relations. A powerful ruler who can turn harsh desert land into a thriving garden appears both capable and generous. The message is clear: if the king can organize nature itself, imagine what he can do with an empire. You stop near a wide reflecting pool where a stone platform extends slightly over the water. From here the garden paths stretch outward in long, symmetrical lines. This vantage point would make an excellent place for a royal pause during a diplomatic walk. Guests might stand beside the king while looking across the entire garden layout. Water channels dividing the land. Trees growing in ordered rows. Birds circling quietly overhead. It's like viewing a miniature model of imperial order. A quirky detail recorded by Greek observers is that Persian nobles sometimes prided themselves on their knowledge of agriculture and gardening. Xenophon even writes about Persian aristocrats personally supervising orchards and taking pride in productive estates. Now, whether every noble actually spent time pruning trees is a matter historians debate. Some scholars think these stories reflect idealized virtues rather than daily reality. It's possible many nobles preferred supervising from comfortable benches while someone else handled the pruning shears. Still, the cultural value placed on cultivated land seems genuine. A well-maintained garden suggests discipline, prosperity, and harmony, all qualities desirable in a ruler. You continue down the path and pass another small pavilion where a group of officials sits in quiet discussion. Their voices remain low, blending with the rustle of leaves. Garden meetings likely provided a more relaxed atmosphere than formal throne rooms. Without rigid ceremony, conversations could flow naturally while participants walked or sat beneath trees. And if a discussion became tense, well, there was always another pathway to stroll along until tempers cooled. It's the ancient diplomatic equivalent of saying, "Let's take a walk and think about it." As the sky deepens into evening colors, lanterns begin appearing along some of the main pathways. Servants carefully light small oil lamps placed on stone posts. The garden glows softly. Reflections shimmer across the water channels like quiet ribbons of light. Even at night, the Paradise Garden continues serving its purpose, not only as a place of beauty but as a symbol of the empire's stability. Visitors leaving the palace carry the memory of these gardens with them. The symmetry, the peaceful atmosphere, the idea that human ingenuity can shape even the most difficult landscapes into something harmonious. And when those visitors return to their own homelands, Greece, Anatolia, Central Asia, they begin imagining something remarkable. What if their own cities had gardens like this? What if they too could build paradise? And so the Persian garden begins a long journey beyond the borders of the empire, quietly influencing landscapes far from the dusty plateau where the idea first took root. You leave the softly glowing garden paths behind and imagine the idea of this place traveling outward, carried not by wind or water, but by people, merchants, diplomats, soldiers, travelers who pass through the Persian Empire and return home with vivid memories of shaded pathways, flowing canals, and orchards arranged with mathematical precision. Ideas, after all, travel almost as easily as caravans. And the Persian Paradise Garden turns out to be a particularly portable idea. One widely accepted historical fact is that Persian cultural influence spread widely during the Achaemenid period, partly because the empire governed an enormous region connecting multiple civilizations. Royal roads, trade routes, and diplomatic exchanges linked Persia with Greece, Anatolia, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Central Asia. which means people were constantly observing how the Persians lived, and occasionally borrowing the good ideas. You can picture a Greek envoy returning home after visiting a Persian palace. He describes the gardens in detail, how the water channels divide the land, how fruit trees grow in neat rows, how shaded paths create cool spaces for walking. Soon someone back home wonders if something similar might work there. The climate may differ slightly, the plant species might change, but the underlying idea remains appealing. Structured gardens, symmetry, water guiding the design. Historians often point out that the Greek word paradisos, which comes from the Persian paradisa, eventually enters Greek literature as a term for royal parks and enclosed gardens. Writers use it to describe cultivated landscapes belonging to kings and nobles. In other words, the Persian garden doesn't just travel physically, it travels linguistically too. Language quietly spreads the concept. And once the word exists, the design is easier to imagine. You walk along an imaginary caravan road heading west toward the Mediterranean. Traders carry spices, textiles, precious metals, and stories. Stories about gardens where water flows in straight channels. Stories about orchards planted with mathematical care. Stories about kings who stroll beneath cypress trees while discussing philosophy. Eventually, some of these ideas appear in the estates of wealthy landowners in other regions. Historians still argue exactly how directly Persian garden design influenced early Greek or Hellenistic landscaping. Some scholars believe the influence was strong, especially after Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire in the 4th century BCE. Alexander's armies and administrators encountered Persian palace gardens throughout the region. When his empire spread across Asia and the Mediterranean, elements of Persian design likely traveled along with it. Others argue that garden traditions evolved independently in different cultures, with Persian ideas simply blending into existing local styles. Either way, the concept of the formal garden begins appearing across a much wider world. And the Persian blueprint continues evolving over time. You imagine traveling eastward now, toward the lands of Central Asia where Persian culture remains influential long after the Achaemenid Empire fades. Later Islamic dynasties adopt and refine the Shahar Bagh layout, incorporating flowing water, shaded pavilions, and geometric planting patterns. These later gardens become even more elaborate. But the core concept remains the same. Divide the land into balanced sections. Guide water carefully through the space. Create harmony between architecture and nature. One of the most fascinating parts of this story is how the Persian garden idea eventually reaches entirely different climates. Take Spain, for example. Centuries later, when Islamic rulers establish kingdoms in parts of the Iberian Peninsula, they bring garden traditions inspired by Persian and Central Asian designs. The famous gardens of Alhambra in Granada, with their symmetrical courtyards and flowing water channels, reflect this lineage. Historians widely recognize the influence. You could say the whisper of Persian paradise travels across continents. And it doesn't stop there. Further east, in the Indian subcontinent, Mughal emperors later built some of the most spectacular garden complexes in history using variations of the Persian Shahar Bagh design. The Taj Mahal itself sits within a grand 4-part garden inspired by Persian layouts. Imagine that. An idea first shaped in dusty Persian palace grounds eventually helping define one of the most famous landscapes on Earth. Not bad for a gardening concept. You pause beside another imaginary water channel in the fading light, thinking about how quietly ideas move through history. Empires rise and fall. Cities change hands. But certain designs continue traveling across centuries because people simply like them. They feel balanced, peaceful, ordered. Persian gardeners probably never imagined their layouts would influence landscapes thousands of miles away. They were just trying to create shade in a hot climate. Yet that practical effort produced something timeless. The idea that nature and architecture can work together to create calm spaces where people slow down, walk gently, and listen to the quiet sound of water. And as the Persian garden spreads across the world, its designers back home continue refining one of its most important challenges: How to keep those gardens cool in the middle of a very warm land. Because paradise, as it turns out, also needs good climate control. You return your attention to the garden itself, where the evening air has become noticeably cooler. At first it feels like a small miracle. Only a few steps beyond the walls, the desert still radiates the heat it absorbed all day. The ground outside remains warm enough to remind you exactly how powerful the sun has been. But inside the garden, beneath the trees and beside the water channels, the air feels softer, cooler, almost comfortable. And this isn't accidental. Persian garden designers understood something very important about climate long before the invention of air conditioning. Electric fans, or the modern luxury of dramatically adjusting your thermostat because the room feels 0.7 degrees too warm. They understood how to engineer shade and airflow. One widely accepted historical fact is that Persian architecture and landscaping often worked together to regulate temperature. Gardens were designed not just for beauty but also for cooling the surrounding environment. Water plays a huge role in this process. As it flows through channels and pools, water slowly evaporates, releasing moisture into the dry air. This evaporation slightly lowers the surrounding temperature, especially when combined with shade from trees. In a desert climate, even a small cooling effect can feel significant. You walk along a narrow path where tall plane trees stretch their branches overhead, creating a leafy canopy. Sunlight filters through the leaves in soft green patterns, and the ground beneath remains several degrees cooler than the open courtyard nearby. Shade, it turns out, is ancient Persia's version of climate control. Persian gardeners deliberately plant trees with broad canopies along walkways and gathering spaces. These trees block direct sunlight during the hottest parts of the day, turning the garden into a patchwork of cool corridors and shaded courtyards. You notice that many pathways run alongside water channels. This isn't just convenient for irrigation, it's also clever environmental design. Moving water cools the air slightly, and the combination of shade plus moisture creates a comfortable microclimate. If you stand near a flowing canal beneath a row of trees, the temperature difference becomes surprisingly noticeable. Now imagine that multiplied across an entire garden. Historians sometimes refer to Persian gardens as early examples of climate-responsive design. Instead of fighting the environment with brute force, the builders work with natural processes, shade, water, airflow, to make the space livable. It's sustainable landscaping before sustainability becomes fashionable. You reach a small pavilion built beside a square reflecting pool. The structure has open archways that allow breezes to pass freely through the interior. This leads to another clever Persian innovation, the windcatcher, or badger. While not present in every early garden structure, windcatchers eventually become a famous feature of Persian architecture. These tall tower-like structures capture passing breezes and funnel cooler air downward into buildings and courtyards. Think of them as ancient natural air conditioners. Wind enters the tower, flows downward through vertical shafts, and circulates through interior rooms. Sometimes the air passes over water basins, cooling even further before reaching the occupants. Historians still debate exactly when windcatchers first became widespread, but the concept fits perfectly with the Persian approach to environmental design. Use nature to your advantage. And if you can redirect a breeze or two while you're at it, even better. You sit briefly on the edge of the pavilion's stone platform and dip your fingers into the reflecting pool. The water feels pleasantly cool compared to the warm evening air. Nearby, a gardener adjusts a small channel gate, letting fresh water flow into the pool before it continues down another canal toward the orchard. Water is always moving in these gardens. Stagnant water warms quickly, but flowing water stays cooler. The entire irrigation network therefore doubles as a subtle cooling system. Another quirky historical tidbit is that some Persian gardens incorporated underground rooms or shaded alcoves where people could rest during the hottest hours of the afternoon. These spaces remained cooler thanks to thick stone walls and airflow from nearby water channels. In other words, the ancient Persian version of escaping the heat might involve retreating to a garden pavilion with a bowl of chilled fruit and the sound of trickling water. Honestly, that still sounds like an excellent strategy. You walk along another shaded path and notice how the garden seems carefully layered. Tall trees create the highest canopy. Below them grow smaller fruit trees and shrubs. Closer to the ground, flowering plants and herbs fill the planting beds. This layered vegetation traps cool air near the ground while reducing the amount of sunlight reaching the soil. It's basically a natural cooling blanket made of leaves. Historians still argue how intentional this layered planting strategy was in the earliest Persian gardens. Some believe the effect emerged naturally from planting fruit orchards beneath taller shade trees. Others think experienced gardeners deliberately cultivated multi-layered plantings to improve both shade and humidity. Either way, the result works beautifully. As twilight deepens, the garden air grows even more comfortable. Crickets begin chirping softly among the leaves, and the water channels reflect the first faint stars appearing overhead. The desert outside may still hold the day's heat, but inside the garden walls, the careful combination of water, shade, and airflow creates something that feels remarkably close to a natural oasis. And yet, despite all this beauty and ingenuity, many of the original Persian paradise gardens have not survived intact. Time, erosion, and changing empires eventually bury many of them beneath layers of sand and soil. But traces remain, and archaeologists continue searching for the lost outlines of these ancient landscapes. You leave the living garden behind in your imagination and drift forward through time to a quieter and slightly dustier scene. The air is still warm, but the trees are gone. Instead of shady pathways and flowing water, you see a wide archaeological site stretching across a pale landscape. Stone fragments lie scattered across the ground. Low ridges of earth hint at buried walls beneath the surface. At first glance, it doesn't look much like paradise. But look closer. Because hidden beneath these layers of soil are the outlines of ancient gardens that once flourished here. Archaeologists working at sites across Iran and the broader Persian world have uncovered traces of old irrigation channels, planting beds, and terrace structures that reveal the existence of royal gardens long vanished from view. One of the most famous examples, as you've already glimpsed earlier in the journey, is Pasargadae, the capital established by Cyrus the Great. When archaeologists began carefully excavating the area in the 20th century, they discovered something remarkable. Stone-lined water channels arranged in geometric patterns. Straight, intersecting, clearly planned. These channels once carried water through a large formal garden, dividing the space into sections that strongly resemble the later Shahar Bagh design. Even though the trees and flowers disappeared centuries ago, the architecture of the garden remained hidden underground like a fossilized blueprint. It's a bit like discovering the foundation of an ancient house and realizing you can still see where the living room and kitchen once stood. Except in this case, the living room probably had pomegranate trees and nightingales. You walk slowly across the imagined excavation site while archaeologists carefully brush dirt away from a section of stone channel. The blocks are worn smooth but still clearly shaped to guide water. One widely accepted historical fact is that Persian gardens often relied on stone-lined canals in major royal complexes. These channels prevented erosion and ensured water flowed exactly where designers intended. And because stone survives much longer than wood or plants, it's one of the main clues modern researchers rely on. You kneel beside a partially uncovered channel where a thin shadow marks the path where water once flowed. For thousands of years this line lay buried, quiet, forgotten, until someone with a trowel and a lot of patience began brushing the soil away. Historians still argue about how extensive some of these early gardens were. At Pasargadae, estimates suggest the royal garden complex may have covered dozens of acres. That's a lot of trees. And even more work for ancient gardeners. Other archaeological sites in Persia and surrounding regions reveal similar patterns: irrigation systems, terrace foundations, and traces of orchard planting that strongly suggest the presence of cultivated gardens. Sometimes the evidence appears in pollen samples preserved in soil layers. By studying ancient pollen grains trapped in sediments, scientists can identify what kinds of plants once grew there: pomegranate, grapevine, almond, and cypress pollen have all been discovered in areas associated with historic Persian settlements. Which means the ghost of the garden still lingers in microscopic form. Nature leaving behind tiny botanical fingerprints. A quirky challenge archaeologists occasionally face is that ancient irrigation channels can look surprisingly similar to ordinary drainage ditches. Imagine spending weeks excavating a trench only to realize it might once have carried either irrigation water or rain runoff. This is why archaeologists combine multiple clues: channel layout, nearby architecture, soil composition, and plant remains, to determine whether a site truly hosted a formal garden. Sometimes the patterns reveal themselves beautifully. Straight lines intersecting at right angles. Central basins surrounded by planting areas. Terraced ground designed to distribute water evenly. When those clues align, researchers can confidently say, yes, a garden once existed here. You continue walking across the quiet site as evening shadows stretch across the ground. The landscape feels peaceful in a different way now, less vibrant than the living gardens you imagined earlier. But still full of history. Each buried channel represents the work of engineers and gardeners who lived thousands of years ago. They dug canals, planted orchards, pruned trees, all to create spaces where people could rest in the shade and listen to the sound of water moving through stone. Some of those gardens thrived for centuries. Others may have faded quickly when irrigation systems failed or political power shifted elsewhere. Empires change, capitals move, and when maintenance stops, even the most carefully designed paradise can slowly return to dust. But the idea of the Persian garden never truly disappears. Even when the original landscapes vanish beneath sand and soil, the design principles continue traveling across cultures and centuries. New gardens appear, new interpretations of paradise. And in distant lands, from Mughal India to Moorish Spain, the ancient Persian blueprint quietly blooms again. You leave the quiet excavation site behind and let your imagination drift outward again, following the long journey of the Persian garden idea as it spreads across centuries and continents. The empire that first shaped these gardens will eventually fade, of course. The Achaemenid rulers fall to Alexander the Great. New dynasties rise, borders shift, languages evolve. But the garden design refuses to disappear. Instead, it adapts. You picture a traveler centuries later walking through Central Asia where Persian culture still influences architecture and art. Courtyards with water channels appear in cities that once lay along the Great Silk Road. Merchants rest beside fountains surrounded by trees planted in careful rows. The blueprint is familiar. Divide the land into balanced sections. Guide water through the center. Create shade where people can sit and think. Historians widely agree that the Persian Shahar Bagh concept becomes especially influential during the later Islamic periods, when Persian cultural traditions merge with new architectural styles across the Middle East and beyond. Garden builders continue using the four-part design to represent harmony and paradise, now connected to Islamic descriptions of heaven as a garden with flowing rivers. In other words, the symbolism evolves, but the structure remains beautifully recognizable. You wander through another imagined garden, this time in medieval Spain. Stone walls surround a courtyard filled with orange trees. Narrow channels carry water between tiled walkways. A small fountain murmurs at the center while patterned tiles reflect sunlight onto the walls. This is the Alhambra in Granada. And while the architecture reflects Moorish artistic traditions, historians clearly see the influence of Persian garden design flowing through its layout. The symmetry, the water channels, the central courtyard, all echo ideas that began centuries earlier in ancient Persia. You stroll beside a rectangular reflecting pool where slender columns frame the view. Water glides silently through narrow channels. Orange blossoms scent the air. It feels like another version of paradise. And the story continues eastward as well. Now imagine traveling to northern India in the 16th and 17th centuries, where the Mughal emperors, descendants of Central Asian rulers deeply influenced by Persian culture, built some of the most spectacular gardens ever constructed. The Mughal emperors adore gardens. Babur, the founder of the Mughal dynasty, even writes in his memoirs about his love for carefully planned gardens with flowing water and fruit trees. Coming from Central Asia, he misses the cooler landscapes of his homeland and begins creating garden complexes wherever he establishes power. And what design does he choose? The familiar Shahar Bagh. 4 quadrants divided by water channels. Perfect symmetry. Shaded pathways and pavilions. One of the most famous examples appears centuries later around the Taj Mahal. You walk through its vast garden in your imagination. Long water channels reflect the white marble mausoleum while cypress trees line the central pathway. The layout follows the same 4-part geometry developed in Persian gardens thousands of miles away. Historians often point out that the Taj Mahal complex represents one of the grandest interpretations of the Persian paradise garden concept. And it works remarkably well. Standing at the center of that garden today, visitors still feel the quiet harmony the original Persian designers were trying to achieve. Balance. Order. Water flowing gently through carefully shaped land. It's a design that speaks to something universal in human psychology. People enjoy symmetry. They enjoy shade. They enjoy the sound of water. And they especially enjoy places where nature feels peaceful rather than chaotic. A quirky historical detail about Mughal gardens is that some emperors reportedly spent long hours personally supervising planting plans and water systems. Which means even centuries later, powerful rulers were still getting very invested in landscaping decisions. Imagine an emperor carefully debating where to plant the next row of cypress trees. Some priorities never change. Historians still argue how directly each later garden tradition connects to the earliest Achaemenid designs. Cultural exchange across centuries is rarely simple. Ideas blend, adapt, and transform as they move between regions. But the thread remains visible. From ancient Persian palace gardens, to Islamic courtyard gardens, to Mughal imperial landscapes, the core vision stays alive. A garden is a model of paradise. A place where flowing water, growing trees, and balanced geometry create a small world of calm within a much larger, messier one. And now, after traveling through all those centuries and across so many landscapes, you find yourself drifting back to where the story began. Back to the quiet Persian garden. Back to the shaded paths. Back to the gentle sound of water moving through stone. Because as night slowly settles over the ancient garden, it becomes the perfect place to take one final peaceful walk. Night settles softly over the garden. The heat of the day fades, and the air becomes cooler, carrying the faint scent of damp soil and distant flowers. You walk slowly along one of the narrow stone paths, listening to the quiet rhythm of water sliding through the channels that divide the garden into its 4 calm sections. Above you, the sky darkens from deep blue to velvet black. Stars begin appearing one by one. In the ancient Persian world, night gardens were often just as important as daytime ones. The desert climate made evenings far more comfortable, and many royal gardens were designed so that people could enjoy them after sunset. Torches might flicker along the paths. Small oil lamps could glow beside fountains. Moonlight would reflect gently off still pools of water. You imagine a quiet evening gathering here thousands of years ago. A few nobles sit on low cushions near the central pavilion. Servants move quietly in the background, bringing cool drinks or small trays of fruit. Musicians might softly pluck a stringed instrument while someone recites poetry about gardens, stars, and the passage of time. Persian poetry, after all, becomes deeply connected to gardens. Many famous poets describe paradise as a lush garden filled with water, fruit trees, flowers, and shade. Even centuries later, Persian literature continues returning to this peaceful imagery. The garden is not just a place to grow plants. It becomes a symbol of harmony, a symbol of beauty, and sometimes, a symbol of life itself. As you stroll beside the water channels, you notice how carefully the paths guide your movement. Garden designers were remarkably skilled at shaping the visitor's experience without making the structure feel obvious. Straight paths encourage calm, steady walking. The central cross-axis draws attention toward the heart of the garden. Trees are planted at measured intervals so that shade appears exactly where it's needed. Even the fountains are positioned so that their sound carries gently across the entire space. It's quiet design, but incredibly thoughtful. Ancient engineers also understood something modern designers still appreciate today. The sound of flowing water naturally relaxes the human mind. In a dry landscape where water was precious, that sound would have felt even more special. A reminder of life, a reminder of abundance, and perhaps even a reminder of paradise. You pause near the central pool. The surface reflects the moon like a silver coin resting on dark glass. Occasionally, a small ripple spreads across the water as a breeze moves through the garden. Beyond the walls, the desert stretches for miles. But inside this enclosure, everything feels ordered and alive. Trees grow in neat rows. Water flows through carved stone. Paths lead gently from one space to another. This contrast was very intentional. Persian gardens were designed as controlled landscapes, carefully shaped environments that stood in contrast to the wild, unpredictable desert outside. In some ways, the garden becomes a statement of human ingenuity. With enough planning, enough effort, and enough cooperation, people could create life in even the harshest environments. It's an idea that quietly echoes through many ancient civilizations. Build wisely. Work together. Care for water and land. And beauty can flourish even in difficult places. You sit for a moment on the edge of the stone pool. The garden is completely still now except for the gentle sound of water slipping through the channels. Somewhere in the distance a night bird calls, then falls silent again. The air smells faintly of cypress and moist earth. If you close your eyes, you can almost imagine the thousands of gardeners who cared for places like this across the centuries. People who trimmed branches, cleaned the water channels, planted new saplings, and quietly maintained the paradise that others came to enjoy. History often remembers kings and emperors. But gardens were built and sustained by patient workers who rarely appear in the records. Yet their work shaped some of the most beautiful spaces the ancient world ever created. As the night deepens, the moon climbs higher above the garden walls. The stars grow brighter, and the sound of the water continues its calm, steady flow, just as it has for thousands of years in gardens inspired by this original Persian design. It's easy to understand why visitors long ago compared these spaces to paradise. Cool shade, fresh water, order and peace. A small world carefully designed to soothe the mind. And now, as your journey through this quiet history comes to an end, you take one final slow walk along the garden path. The torches flicker softly. The water glides through stone channels. The trees whisper gently in the night breeze. And somewhere between the stars above and the flowing water below, the ancient Persian garden rests exactly as it was always meant to be. A peaceful place to wander, reflect, and slowly drift into sleep.